Hello, NR 220 students, and welcome to week one range. My name is Rick Knight. I'm the guy in the picture wearing the hat. The instructors for range for this summer, Troy, the guy with the thumbs up, he's going to be responsible. He'll be the instructor responsible for range for the first two sessions. I'm going to be the faculty member responsible for range for the middle session. And then Becky, with the $1 million smile and the handsome dog, is going to be the range instructor for the final session, which is 004. Ariane, down there standing in front of the pinon pine, he's going to be an instructor for those first two sessions with Troy and the middle session with me. And then the lady in the upper right that's starting a prescribed fire, she'll be the teaching assistant for all four of the sessions. What can we say about range and about NR 220? I think it's actually worthwhile pausing just for a second and realizing that NR 220 is not an ordinary course. Leopold captured what this course is all about way back in 1949 in one of the earlier writings about conservation in America. He wrote, "What the student now needs is a course which cuts at right angles to the arbitrary divisions of the land problem. A course which describes the common mechanism of soils, water, plants, and animals as a whole, a single whole." And that's what NR 420 does, NR 220, excuse me, does. When you think about it, we have 5 different disciplines, 5 different instructors, and then 5 teaching assistants. What we try to do is expose you to these different components of ecosystems, and then when we do these community days, we integrate it all together. And Leopold went on to say something else, and this was way back in 1939, so this was long before the smartphones were conceived. Leopold wrote, "In a surprising number of people there burns a curiosity about machines and a loving care in their construction, maintenance, and use. Everyone knows this. But what few realize is that an equal bent for the mechanisms of nature is a possible earmark of some future generation." And even though NR 220 has been taught for over 100 years, it is the manifestation of what Leopold had in mind. This course will expose you to understanding land, plants and animals, soil and water, like probably no other course you may ever take will. Okay, a little bit about the instructors for range for week one. So even though I'm going to be responsible for range in the middle session, Ariane and I are producing the materials for the first week of range. So all 4 of the sessions are going to be exposed to this. So that's me with the 3 horses. I'm a professor emeritus in the Warner College of Natural Resources. I'm vice president of conservation of the Colorado Cattlemen Agricultural Land Trust, the largest land trust in the state, and I'm a conservation practitioner. Ariane Brazenwood, as you can see here by this by this Rocky Mountain juniper, he just completed his master's degree in forestry, and his undergraduate degree was in conservation, both in the Warner College of Natural Resources. And he's going to be teaching, as I said, instructing in range the first 2 sessions and the middle session, and then he'll be switching to forestry for the final session. Okay, the expectations. So week 1 is going to be this range ecology and identification. That's going to be, I'm going to be providing the material along with Ariane for the material for range for week 1. Week 2, Becky is taking over, and she's going to be providing the instructional videos for how you actually assess the condition of a piece of rangeland, the health of the piece of rangeland. And then weeks 3 and 4, it's going to be the application. Troy is going to take over, and we'll be doing forage production and stocking rates in a riparian ecosystem. And then the very first of the plant community days will be mountain shrub, and that will be myself, Sunshine Sweatman from the Human Dimensions program in Arion once more. The class expectations, the first exam will be week 2. This is class expectations for range. The first exam will be week 2. It'll be plant characteristics and identification. And then the second exam will be week 3, where it will be questions on range condition based on the material you're exposed to in week 2. And then there's 2 final exams. They both occur on the last day of week 4. Plant identification is one of them, and then the information from the community days, the different community days, and the disciplines. Those will be in that exam. Okay, you shall not pass without learning to identify plants. So it is going to be extremely important in forestry for the shrubs and the trees, and in range for the grasses and the forbs. And of course, you'll also have to learn how to identify fish and wildlife, as well as other components of ecosystems. Why no plants? Sometimes some people just don't gravitate to plants, and lots of other people do. Foresters obviously do, range conservationists do, but there's some people that just don't gravitate to plants. And I must admit, I probably was one of those people a long time ago. I've since gotten over it. The reason it's important to know plants is, above anything else, they are the great integrators of the environment. You think about it. They've got their roots in the soil. They're absolutely dependent upon water. Climate, they're not only dependent upon climate, they contribute to the alteration of climate, right? They're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and releasing oxygen, so all of us can breathe. And then, of course, you have these animals that are so dependent upon them. And then human land uses. So many different human land uses are dependent upon plants and plant communities. Obviously, the whole livestock grazing business is dependent upon grasses and forbs. The whole forestry producing wood products is dependent upon forests. And there's so many other human uses of plant communities. Another reason is plants are indicators of ecosystem health. For example, if you are trained and you can walk an ecosystem, say some sort of rangeland, and you can separate native from non-native plants, you can come up with an assessment of the health of that particular ecosystem. If it's dominated by non-native invasive plant species, you can say it's obviously undergone some sort of great disturbance over time and has been invaded, taken over by these non-natives. Being able to identify plants and then seeing and identifying them in the field, you can measure how far away you are from management goals. Like, are you trying to manage for a late successional stage plant community? There are certain plants that are characteristic of those late successional stage plant communities. And if you can identify your plants, then you can say that how near or how far you are from that particular management goal. And then the other thing, just to develop an eye for reading the land. This is what Aldo Leopold, when he was talking about the land ethic, he said the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, water, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. And Leopold went on to say, once you learn to read the land, in other words, being able to identify the plants and the animals, I have no fear of what you will do to it or with it, and I know many pleasant things it will do to you. What he meant by, I have no fear of what you will do to it, you as future conservation practitioners will help steward our lands and our waters for lots of important reasons. And then I know many pleasant things it will do to you. There is no doubt the better you understand ecosystems, the more things you can identify, then you can start to sort of read the land and look at the interactions between the plants and the plants and the animals, the soil and the water. So Leopold was completely right on that. And you want to understand these components of ecosystems as a future conservation practitioner. As an example of this, so here's 2 slides. One shows bison, a native species in a riparian area, which is great, right? Here we have the native herbivore where it belongs in a piece of rangeland. And the bottom one is this slide of this beautiful pasture with these yellow flowers and the lake in the distance. And both of these seem to be idyllic pictures and healthy ecosystems. But we're wrong on that. Even though the bison are native, they've clearly been confined to this bit of riparian rangeland, and they've overgrazed it or overbrowsed it even. There are no riparian shrubs and trees such as willows in there, so it's really being over grazed. It's being hit hard, and you're even starting to see incising of the stream. And then on the bottom one, those beautiful yellow flowers are all a non-native forb. This is what Leopold had in mind. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on the land is quite invisible to lay people. This is why it's important for us as conservation practitioners to be able to read landscapes, to be able to identify the plants and the animals, the soil and the water, and the different human land uses. And this is what NR 220 is all about, and it will be, in a sense, the beginning of a lifetime and hopefully very enjoyable careers as conservation practitioners. So you can read the land, and you can look at different human land uses, and maybe start to write prescriptions so the land is better stewarded. So rangelands, it's one of the disciplines, one of the 5 disciplines in NR 220. What are rangelands? This is really important. They are ecosystems composed primarily of grasses, forbs, and shrubs. Okay, so ecosystems composed primarily of grasses and forbs and shrubs. So think of grasslands, think of shrublands, think of tundra, think of deserts. They are primarily grasses and forbs and shrubs. Okay. Rangelands are also naturally growing plants. So these are plants whose evolutionary history put them there. They're not irrigated and they are not fertilized. Surprisingly, rangelands, if you include things like grasslands and shrublands and tundra and deserts, you're including almost 1/2 of the world's landmass. Approximately 47% of the world's landmass qualify as rangelands. And well over 1/3 of the landmass in the United States, and over 1/2 of the landmass in the western states are rangelands. Rangelands are different from pastures. So pastures are lands of domesticated forage plants for livestock. So by domesticated forage plants, we're talking about non-native grasses and forbs. I guess you could throw in shrubs, but it's primarily grasses and forbs. Rangelands are diverse and extensive. Just to show you, across North America, we have mountain grasslands, we have plains grasslands, we have mixed prairie, we have Sonoran desert, we have oak woodlands, and we have Arctic tundra. And those are just some of things that would qualify as rangelands. Now let me pause and say something about this oak woodlands, because nobody had been saying rangelands could include forest lands. Things like oak woodlands, and even healthy ponderosa pine forests, they are not closed canopies. They have open canopies allowing lots of sunlight in, and so you'll often see healthy grasslands and forbs through the open canopy beneath the oak or beneath the ponderosa pine. So believe it or not, things like oak woodlands and ponderosa pine forests in a healthy state where you've got these open canopies are often considered to be rangelands. And they're extensive across the globe. So you've got the tundra of the Arctic, you've got the sagebrush steppe, which defines so much of the American West, you've got the Sonoran desert in the southwestern part of America, you've got the cerrados of Brazil, the outback of Australia, African savanna, and the Mongolian plains. Rangelands are extensive and they're extremely diverse. The alpine tundra we should include, as well as the tundra of the northern latitudes. Rangelands are important. They're obviously important in livestock production. They're important in producing forage crop For wildlife habitat, for example, these elk are browsing and grazing on western rangelands. For water quality and quantity of water, for native plants, open space, and increasingly rangelands are being sought out by recreationists to get outdoors and enjoy open spaces. All right, rangelands and grazing. So grazing is an important ecological process in all rangelands. Now, not all rangelands are grazed by livestock, by domestic animals. Not all rangelands, okay, that's true. But all rangelands are grazed, from moose to grasshoppers. So please understand that all rangelands have grazers on them, but not all rangelands have domestic livestock on them. It's also important to understand that rangelands are a kind of land. They're an ecosystem, but they're not a land use. A land use might be livestock grazing or energy development that might occur on rangeland ecosystems. So we've talked quite a bit about rangelands. I think it's time to say the obvious, that rangelands are also threatened. In some parts of the world, we have unsustainable livestock grazing practices, so we have severe overgrazing. Believe it or not, there's parts of the world where we have overabundant wild herbivores. And a lot of you have probably heard the stories about overbrowsing by elk in Rocky Mountain National Park and overbrowsing by elk in Yellowstone National Park. So that can also happen. Then we have these non-native plant species that come in and invade rangelands like cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum. There's millions and millions of acres of western rangelands that have been taken over. The native grasses and shrub communities have been taken over by Bromus tectorum. And some of you may have even heard how that Bromus tectorum, being an annual that greens up early and turns brown, has altered the fire regimes, and that's then you have a different fire regime based on this non-native grass that then causes damage for the sagebrush shrubs, and so we're losing these shrub-dominated rangelands because of this non-native plant species and this altered fire regime. Climate change is going to be a threat, of course, for all ecosystems of the planet. And then increasing development, exurban development. The American population is still increasing. We lose the size of Rocky Mountain National Park every year in Colorado in rangelands that are taken out of ranching and reappear in housing developments. Okay, herbaceous plants. So rangelands, remember, are grasses, forbs, and shrubs. What we're going to focus on here are the herbaceous plants, the grasses and the forbs. So an herbaceous plant is a non-woody, so there's no woody plant material like you'd find in a shrub, non-woody vascular plant that dies back to the ground each year. Most herbaceous plants are perennial. Now that doesn't mean the plant dies. If it's perennial, the plant lives when that above ground plant material dies back after the first serious frost of the year in temperate environments. That perennial grass or forb continues to live, but it lives below ground in its roots. And then when spring comes and the days get longer and the temperatures increase, it starts growing above ground again. So the two categories of non-woody vascular plants, of herbaceous plants, are forbs and graminoids. What are forbs? Forbs are plants with typical flowers, so sepals and petals, such as the wild strawberry. Forbs are, these typical flowers are the type of flowers that you would buy for your mother on Mother's Day. Okay? Graminoids are grasses and grass-likes, such as sedges and rushes. And these are plants with linear leaves and modified flowers. In other words, they do not look like the flowers that you would buy for your mother on Mother's Day. Here's another sort of component of understanding grasses and forbs and understanding rangelands. There's two different seasons of growth. We have these two major types: cool season grasses and forbs and warm season grasses and forbs. So the cool season grasses are plants that flower in June, in other words, flower early, provide spring forage, such as bluegrasses and wheatgrasses. And then warm season plants are the ones that flower later, such as in July, so what you'd call mid to late summer. And they have minimal growth in spring. The plant, of course, still alive, but it's just alive below ground. This picture was taken in April at 5,000 feet. And you can see two different grasses. The one on the left is greened up, so that's clearly a cool season grass because April is still early. I guess you could call that mid-spring. And then the grass to the right of it, which appears dead, that's actually a warm season grass. That's blue grama, and as you can see, the above ground plant material is still dead. It hasn't started to green up. So you've got a cool season grass and next to a warm season grass. You would mistakenly confuse the warm season grass as being dead. It's not. It just doesn't green up and flower until mid to late summer. Okay, this is extremely important. Herbivory, the eating of plant material. Now, there's two different types of herbivores. There are browsers and there are grazers. The browsers eat woody plant material, so for example, shrubs and trees. And grazers eat herbaceous plant material, grasses and forbs. Livestock and wild herbivores can actually do both. There are some, for example, deer and elk both graze and browse, even though people tend to characterize elk as being grazers and mule deer as being browsers. They actually do both. I'm sure you've seen mule deer and white-tailed deer, for example, in somebody's hayfield. So they're obviously grazing there. But you've also seen them in mountain shrub communities eating woody plant material, so they're browsing. So a single species can be both a browser and a grazer, but it's important to understand when you are browsing, you're eating plants with woody material, and when you're grazing, you're eating these non-vascular herbaceous plants. Okay, grasses and forbs and shrubs have co-evolved with being eaten. That's extremely important. Herbivory is a natural form of disturbance, just like fire, flooding, drought, and insect diseases. So these are natural ecological processes. Grazing is a natural form of disturbance. Plants have co-evolved with being grazed and or browsed. The important thing, of course, to remember is that grasses, they can be overgrazed. In other words, when you have too many herbivores on for too long a period of time, and you'll be left with bare ground and dying grasses. But they can also be over-rested, and that's what we call thatching. So if you exclude grazers from them, they grow and they grow, and then they start to fall over and they block sunlight, and that interrupts photosynthesis. So the plant's stressed and living on the carbohydrates in its roots, and over time it weakens and eventually dies. So it's important to realize that grazing is a natural ecological process. Both grazing and browsing are natural ecological processes, and you can overgraze, but you can also over-rest grasses. The key to getting them right is understanding the timing, intensity, and frequency. That's where the land manager comes in, because in response to grazing, if you focus on trying to get the timing, intensity, and frequency right, you can ensure that these rangelands stay in healthy condition. Okay, what are timing, intensity, and frequency? Timing, for example, do you remember we said that these vascular plants, the above ground material dies back, but the plant lives below ground? So when summer fades into fall and fall goes into winter, that above ground plant material dies back. So grazing during that dormant season is perfectly fine. You know, if that above ground dead plant material can be eaten without actually affecting the plant. But during the growing season, the outcome can be quite different. So during the growing season, that above ground plant material is no longer dead. It's green. It's conducting photosynthesis. So the thing there, timing shifts to the importance of understanding intensity and frequency of grazing. Intensity of grazing is how many grazers present, of what kind, and for how long. So those three things actually determine the intensity that plants are grazed. How many are present, what kind, and for how long. Understand this, the more leaf area that is removed, the more slowly the plant will be able to recover. This is obviously during the growing season, right? So if you have a lot of animals that are pretty intensive grazers for extended periods of time, that above ground leaf material during the growing season is getting constantly clipped, isn't it? And yet that's the material, that green above ground material is what's doing the photosynthesis and sending the carbohydrates to the roots and allowing the plant to grow. So frequency of contact with grazers is critical. And frequency is simply how often a plant is grazed. Grazing without rest to recover will stress a plant. So that's where you start really getting this concept of overgrazing. And of course, altering these in the other direction will actually influence the concept of over-resting, and where you start getting thatching. Okay, we have, this is the last slide of the PowerPoint, we have different responses to herbivory, to herbivores, to grazing and browsing. So we have increasers, decreasers, and invaders. Increasers are plant species that increase when the more palatable species are decreasing. Obviously, not all plants are created equal, so you have some plants that are very palatable and grazers are eagerly seeking those. They're going to probably graze those first. In other words, they'll go after the pizza before they go after the spinach, and they'll go after those more palatable species, and they then run the risk of actually being overgrazed. They are decreasing, which is decreasing the amount of competition that other plants that are less palatable are facing, so they increase. So the increasers are plant species. Increasers would be another way of saying less palatable plant species, and decreasers are those highly palatable species. So if you say a plant's a decreaser, it's probably another way of saying it's a highly palatable species, and it decreases in response to grazing without rest. Invaders, they appear after extreme disturbance. Now, invaders can be native species, but they can also be non-native species. Okay, so we're using this sort of general category. We're not talking about exotics necessarily, but you can have Bromus tectorum, which is a non-native. Increases after a disturbance. For example, if somebody's grading a road, it's not surprising to see Bromus tectorum, the seeds there. There's a seed in the soil, seed base in the soil, and it sprouts up after that extreme disturbance. Or you could even have a native plant species like fireweed, a forb. It's one of the forbs you're going to have to know. Following disturbance like along a forest road or fire, you'll see that increase. So invaders, they are native and non-native grasses and forbs that appear after extreme disturbance. And it can be natural disturbance or it can be human caused. So that's the last slide of this introduction to range, week 1. And we're going to have a few other PowerPoints that are going to get you into starting to know characteristics of plants, and then the different grasses and forbs you'll have to know. Take care, do good work, and stay in touch. Adios.